These are the 11 transformative novels that I read in the month of August with the Right Conscious Book Club. And today I'm going to talk to you guys and tell you why each one is transformative and why you should read it. And if you do not know, my name is Ian, and here on Right Conscious, we talk about the best books and authors of all time. I also help readers and writers like you activate so that we can create a literary renaissance. And so last month I was very busy, as I always am, reading and writing. And for those who ask, how can you read 11 books a month, especially some of these which are huge books? Well, much like anything, if you want to get good at it, you need to dedicate anywhere from 4 to 6 hours a day to do it. You need to be listening to audiobooks. When I'm at some meeting and my principal is just yapping on and on about nothing, I usually get 100 pages done during those meetings. With all my classes, I make them read silently for 10 minutes each day, and I do it with them, which adds another hour on. And so that's how I get it done. But I'm not here to talk about me. I'm here to talk about you and some books that you really need in your life. And so the first thing we read in the book club were the short stories of Ernest Hemingway. And this is not a novel, but it is longer than most novels. And Ernest Hemingway is one of the best short story authors of all time, especially if you read his Nick Adams stories. And I'm going to tell you guys right now a sequence of 4 Hemingway stories that you should read that won't take you very long. They're all pretty short, some only being like 3 pages long, that will show you Hemingway's talent and also give you a glimpse of the best writing on masculine trauma ever, because the trauma industry has been commodified. It's been turned into a simulacra. It's been brought into relationships and into households and into the workplace with people saying, you're crossing my boundaries, you're gaslighting me, like all that. And sometimes that's okay, but it's become a whole thing now. But Hemingway was in World War I. PTSD, the term, the idea didn't even exist yet. Battle fatigue or whatever was the term. And Hemingway is a master of writing trauma because he was one of the last writers not to get sucked down the rabbit hole of Proustian or Dostoevskyan over-explanation. Because when you look at books like Infinite Jest, which we'll talk about in a second, that book is about trauma, but it is a maximalist approach. It is this kind of info dump. There's so much trauma literature out there. The Tunnel by Gass. I mean, I could just go on, where we're just inside the heads of these kind of odd, traumatized characters, and we're hearing all of their problems and like working through that. And that's fine. And then on the other side, we have now this, like this Bret Easton Ellis American psycho-minimalism, where sometimes writers create these insane characters and we don't have very much interiority or description, but there are these wild characters which are appealing. But with Hemingway, many of his characters aren't extravagant and he has little to no interiority, but he still makes it work. And the way that he does that is through this idea of the iceberg theory, through hiding symbols and ideas all throughout his works. And the best 4 stories to watch this in action, to see Hemingway kill it, are, and you should read them in this order: Indian Camp, Now I Lay Me, Away You'll Never Be, and Big Two-Hearted River, both parts. If you read those 4 stories with the perspective of this is Hemingway writing about trauma, you will be very, very impressed at what he was doing, especially for the time. A lot of these were written over 100 years ago. You will have a newfound respect for Hemingway. And I think that being able to tap into this is really important for us in the modern world, because Hemingway shows us how to heal, and his methodology is by using nature. When you look at Indian Camp and Big Two-Hearted River, his character, Nick Adams, is healing through nature, working through his trauma and his problems with nature. And nature is one, and solitude is one of the classic ways to deal with trauma. And now that we've become so inundated with technology, now that going into nature is a competition. Oh, I hiked a 14,000 foot peak in Colorado. I mean, I remember living in Utah and Oregon and other various places, and going out in nature and spending time backpacking and do all this became this tally. Like, oh, I spent this much time out there and I did this. Not going out there for van life or for Instagram, but just going out there to go out there with no ambition. That's what so many authors built their entire metaphysical and spiritual conception of the world through and how they healed themselves. I mean, it's funny because they're all in the same lineage. Melville, Hemingway, Cormac McCarthy, all great authors who did that. And I think that that's why there's such a resurgence in interest about those authors. I know so many men right now that love and are into Hemingway, McCarthy, and Melville. Why? There is a biblical side to it. There is a resurgence of Christianity for many people who were like intellectual atheists back in the day and have like swung back the other way. And like, there's some of that going on, but there's also a return happening of people trying to move back to the primordial, trying to move back to this universal dark Gnostic energy that all three of these authors were talking about. And so I do recommend the complete short stories of Ernest Hemingway. I once again recommend that right now you can find all these online for free. Just type in Indian Camp short story. You will find a PDF. Indian Camp, Now I Lay Me, A Way You'll Never Be, and Big Two-Hearted River. I will post that down in the description and pinned comment below for all of you guys. And what's awesome about doing my book clubs is that I get to hear how usually the book clubs are anywhere from 10 to 20 people, depending on the book, how different people feel about these texts and what they get from it. And that's why reading literature with others, whether in person with your spouse, your dad, whoever, it's so important because your conception of literature is just a slice of the entire picture most of the time. And you could read all the secondary sources and do all of that. But in general, the best way to get a secondary source is just to read it with somebody else. And so the next book that we read, speaking of dark Gnostic texts, was Child of God by Cormac McCarthy. And this one is only 30,000 words long. And so if you've never read Cormac McCarthy before, this is one of his Southern Gothic novels and his most read Southern novel. I think it's just because of the title, like, oh, Cormac McCarthy wrote a book called Child of God. And even though this is one of my least favorite Cormac McCarthy novels, it is still one of the better books of all time because he just is on such a different level, in my opinion. And so one of the reasons why you should read this work, and maybe I can give you some intel before you get into it without spoiling anything, is that on the first page, I'm going to spoil the first like 2 pages. There is this character named Lester Ballard, who is this, one could say, kind of inbred lunatic, and they are the government is auctioning off his property. And once they throw him off and he's displaced because he doesn't work and all this other stuff, it kicks off this really dark chain of events that's written beautifully because it's Cormac McCarthy. Like, it's so good. But this novel is a critique of Cormac McCarthy's father, because Cormac McCarthy's father's job was to throw people off of their land in Tennessee, like Lester Ballard, for the government. And McCarthy felt strongly that this was a huge net negative and this was government intrusion. And when that combines with technology, whether that's cars or media and some of the other stuff that's explored in Child of God and his early Southern novels, it creates this dark energy. This novel was a prophetic vision of what people like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, I can't remember some other names, and so many other individuals were going to do. McCarthy understood with people like Anton Chigurh that we were heading in a new direction toward, for instance, the Columbine energy, the 9/11, terrorist energy, or whatever you believe. And so this novel is anti-civilization, anti-technology, anti-modernity, and it's really good. It's a really fast read. If you like Southern Gothic novels, if you read William Faulkner short stories, Flannery O'Connor short stories, A Good Man's Hard to Find, or Good Country People, whatever, A Rose for Emily, you will like this. It's darker and better. This novel also has many Gnostic themes. Cormac McCarthy, through almost all of his works, was exploring Gnosticism. And if you are not into Gnosticism yet, it is one of the stronger things that you can study. I'm not a Gnostic. I don't really believe in it. But when you look at almost all world religions that weren't, okay, I won't go too deep into it, but when you look at most religions, whether that's pagan or like Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity and Islam, not as much, they have this conception of the world that is very Gnostic. And even American religions like the LDS Church, aka the Mormons, have a somewhat Gnostic view toward reality. And so this novel is a really cool primer in so many different ways, and it's a fun read. This one I would say is McCarthy's best page turner. Like, this is one could say an entertaining read. He wrote this because he needed money. This was as far as he was willing to go into the realm of entertaining writing, and it's still very, I would say, evocative. I think it takes a certain perspective to make it transformative. Hopefully I delivered that to you. Like, if you're just like a pro-civilizational pro-civilization status that believes in nothing or something like super vanilla, then this may not be for you. But if you're into true crime, you will love this. I've found that this is the Cormac McCarthy fan base of readers and listeners of his work is like over 90% men easily. But I've found that women like this novel a ton, compared to a lot of other Cormac McCarthy novels. And so it's a fun one to read with your wife. I'm thinking right now of some ladies who have read this with us in the book club, Lizzie, Stephanie, Marilyn. I know I'm blanking on some others because we've done this 2 times. Yeah, they were all fans of it. And speaking of which, right now we are reading every single Cormac McCarthy book in the Right Conscious Book Club, alongside 5 to 9 more novels every single month. We are, the Right Conscious Book Club, the most active book club online. Every other booktuber out there, love them all. They do 1 book a month. And what if you don't like that book? You're out of luck for that month. We read so many novels, not so that you can read them all, because that's kind of crazy. I am overloaded with reading and with work, but rather so that you can choose from a wide selection, and that there will be at least 1 book a month that will be awesome for you, if not multiple. And speaking of the book club, the schedule for the rest of 2025 is out, everybody. We are reading some crazy stuff. We are having a Southern Gothic week. We are having a Japanese week. We are doing some Female Legends week. So many cool things. We're having a philosophy week in January and a sci-fi week. We'll be doing a fantasy week. The Right Conscious Substack, where the book club is located, also features daily content from me on writing, on reading. I do live streams and a ton of other stuff. I have easily 50 to 70 hours of content available for you right now if you want to support me and the literary renaissance. I also do free live streams and release free content all of the time. And so if you are interested in supporting me and checking out Substack, which is the home of the best writers and readers in the world right now, and where you should be building a reading audience if you are a writer, or finding new authors if you are a reader, my link is down below. Go check it out. You can subscribe to me and it would mean the world, or just get familiar with Substack, because like I said, it is an awesome place and the best social media platform in the world, because it's based on reading and writing. And so I hope to see you guys soon in the book club, and let's move on to the next book. So the next book I read was Infinite Jest, but we're reading Infinite Jest over the course of 5 months in the book club. But reading 200 pages of Infinite Jest is like reading an entire 300-page novel. I mean, it is dense. And so, as always, Infinite Jest is one of the more transformative novels of all time, because it deals with family trauma, addiction, and entertainment, which is something that there is at least one of those 3 that you have a problem with. Whether it is you have problems with your family, or had problems with your family, you are an addict to entertainment and fantasy, or hate the world of technology, or you've had problems with addiction or drugs or whatever in your lifetime, or you just are interested in drugs. Like, Wallace gives crazy perspectives on weed and so many other things. And so if you have not tried out this novel yet, I would do it. I have a course over on Substack that will walk you through step by step, chapter by chapter of this novel. It is concluding in October, but we're like 700 pages done right now. And so I would love to see you over there and help you get through the book. And in 2026 and every year in the future, we will have another book club starting each summer on Infinite Jest, if you are watching this sometime in the future. And so I rant about this book all the time, so I will keep it short. So next we have Speak Memory by Vladimir Nabokov, which is one of the coolest autobiographies ever written, because it will subvert all your expectations of biographies or autobiographies. When you read a biography or an autobiography, like a lot of the time it's written by a ghostwriter. Like if you read like the Keith Richards autobiography, it's just a bunch of fluff. It's just this happened and this happened, and it's nice to read, it's fast to read. And that's the same even with some of the best biographers in the world. Like I just read the Mark Twain biography. I don't remember who that was by. He's like one of the most famous biographers in the world right now. His name's slipping my mind. Anyway, and it was fun. It was great. I love Mark Twain, awesome. There's actually not enough biographies out there about authors, Dostoevsky's and even worse, there's not enough audiobooks of biographies of authors. Like the Dostoevsky biography, the David Foster Wallace biography, like so many biographies that I love about authors don't have audiobooks, which is just mind-blowing, because I just think there's so much potential for money there. Because I usually like to listen to biographies or history books, unless they're like super dense, over audiobook, because I can handle it, because I can follow it. Like it's a little bit harder for me to listen to fiction. I can do it. It just is a little bit, it depends. But anyway, this autobiography is not like this, because Nabokov went on this crazy streak. He wrote Lolita, Pale Fire, pen and speak memory across the course of, I don't know how many years, like 5 to 8 years. And it was one of the greatest streaks of, a couple novels within a decade of all time. And so speak memory is really odd because it's not what you expect. Like I said, we expect a biography to, first of all, be honest, to give us all the information. And Nabokov is very elusive. The language in this is great. Nabokov is one of the best stylists ever in terms of prose, especially because he wrote in English. A lot of the time we read a lot of a lot of the greatest authors who have the greatest ideas, we read in translation, which can create some problems because people like Dostoevsky, their works have been doctored up a lot of the time by translators like P&V and whoever. And it's not actually how they, what was being written. But Nabokov is interesting because he was a master stylist in Russian and then became a master stylist in English. But we get the best of both worlds in the sense that we have this man who was raised in like nobility, basically in Russia, who is this talented author, and we get to read him in English, which is, like I said, very rare. And so I think that helps his appeal too, that he had this European sentiment and talent, and he brought it over here and was looking around at the landscape in the late 1950s and early 1960s and like, yeah, I could be a better stylist than William S. Burroughs or whoever else was popular around that time. And so this autobiography is really weird because he doesn't divulge in what you exactly want him to divulge in. Because what Speak Memory is an aristocratic framing of his memories. Because Nabokov basically lived in a bubble with tutors and, tennis courts, a private library, like all this stuff. And even as all that disappeared and he had to flee and become an exile of Russia, he still idolized all that. He still viewed that as the ideal. And so it's interesting that he brings this conception of beauty that ignores negativity. It almost reminds me of like the New Age world. Like I was involved because I was a yoga teacher and I was always kind of a skeptic of like these New Age people, and always pretty kind, sometimes very manipulative and like culty, but they all have this worldview of like, we can't let any negativity in. Like I have to set my boundaries. Like I have to, got to keep my vibe up, all this stuff. And I was like, dude, I get that. And like, it's important to hold a strong vibe and like not get totally empathetically caught up in like political polarization traps or worrying about the kids in Africa every single day, even though can't do anything about it. Like that's okay. But they like got rid of all negativity. Like anything that was a downer, they just deleted. And the aristocratic viewpoint of reality, of holding beauty at this ideal that's more important than anything and moving away from all ugliness, is somewhat similar, and that's how Nabokov felt like, because when he writes about the Russian Revolution and all these things, he just dismisses it and doesn't explore it. He doesn't explore so many different facets of his life that you want to him explore. But instead he focuses on all this other stuff and idolizes it. And it's really cool to see like him doing it and like writing from this framing. Like you may think like, oh, an aristocrat, that's snooty. But in terms of if you are a writer, it's like talent on the page, which is awesome. And it's something that everyone does. Like all of us have these odd framings toward reality, but Nabokov was okay with it. One of my favorite things about the aristocratic mind and the aristocratic mind's lifestyles, people say, you're moving your hands, you're doing baton gestures right now, Ian. Why are you moving your hands? I was told in Communications 101 that you must keep your hands there because it's distracting. And that is British programming, everyone. That is aristocratic programming, because Italians and poor people use their hands to speak. And they said, we don't want to show our emotions. We are purely logical beings that show no emotion and make rational decisions. And let me just tell you guys, those are not the people you want to fucking be around. Like, you don't want to be around the dude throwing his arms around like Hitler, or like, the abusive Italian uncle that touches you, but also the logical dude that is manipulating everyone behind the scenes and wife is on Valium. That's just as bad. And so anyway, but what Nabokov is doing is really smart, because omission is important. What's funny about framing, and if you understand your framing, so many people think that their conception of the world is right, which is crazy, because once you understand all the different framings of reality, it's really hard to feel like that. And like the best thing you can do is like apply your best thinking. But what if you don't even have very many frames to go through to find your best thinking? Anyway, the same is true with writers. Writers can be, as a writer, it's very easy to be flexible and see a situation from so many different sides. But good writing most of the time frames, this is what Nabokov showed with like Lolita and stuff. Having a strong frame that you stick to is important, because much like many aspects of religion and personal development, it's not about what you do. It's about what you don't do. It's about what you omit. And with art, if you can learn to constrain yourself, restrain yourself, like what Jane Austen does in Mansfield Park, like she's, I'm sure, a big influence on Nabokov. If you can do that, I mean, it's even what Hemingway does. Like, if you can restrain yourself from oversharing and thinking you need to do this and that, and you figure out how to do it in an artistic way, that's how you reach excellence. Or at least that's one of the pathways to do it. And what's so cool about this book is that Nabokov isn't trying to retell history, because we get caught up in that so much. I'm writing a historical novel. I have to show what it's like. I have to get it all right. I have to go do my research and get my documents, but it's 8 years later and you're still not done with the research. I've seen that happen a million times. But what Nabokov is rather doing, and this is so cool, it's like metafictional, which kind of goes into Pale Fire, Lolita, even Pin, like all of that. He's recreating an image of himself as himself, which is so good. You know, we've seen this a little bit, or we could say a lot with like autofiction, with like Dallin, Nosgard with My Confession, which people are so funny. People are like, Nosgard wrote a book called My Confession. It's like this sprawling piece of like Proustian autofiction that's like, I would say, a masterpiece, especially in some sections. And people are like, oh, funny title. Isn't that Hitler's title? It's like, dude, for all of time, we can't name some, like, it's just such a simple title. It's not like Hitler's memoir was named, the Black Hawk warrior who was struck down from the sky, or something super specific. My Confession is like it's like a very common phrasing. And sometimes the best titles are common phrasings that are short and sweet. So anyway, like whatever. And so anyway, I like this. I like Nabokov flexing, showing his artistic autonomy, being ironic with metafiction. Like, this is, if you're into that stuff, if you're into postmodernism or metafiction, this is where you need to look. Not, a lot of the more recent stuff, even like Infinite Jest. I think this stuff is much more accessible, because the problem with like William Gass and House of Leaves, Infinite Jest, like those are people who read Nabokov and went their own direction, and you can't follow them anymore. You have to go upstream a while and then, divert your own flow, because if you're trying to copy Infinite Jest or like that, like you're it's like a creek at that point. It's like its own thing. And so that's why I appreciate Nabokov, because he's one of those OG innovators that I think a lot of people, whether you're a reader or a writer, can get a lot from. So the next book we read was Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. And Ishiguro is one of the best novelists alive right now, by far. I'm not saying he's the best, but he's definitely in that group. And that's partially because he is the master, I think, the best of all time, maybe outside of Nabokov, of writing unreliable narrators. And it's honestly really hard to do. I mean, when I first read this novel, and then I read Remains of the Day, I didn't know anything about Ishiguro. This was a while back. I mean, this was before I started teaching. I was substitute teaching for a year as I was like getting a degree or getting the certifications and stuff. And I did some like job for 2 weeks for an English teacher, and they just had a bookshelf, and I would just go in there, and the teacher had left the plans. This is what they're doing. They're all really good kids. You just do what you want. And I didn't have a laptop at that time, which was funny, and the school computer was locked down. So a lot of the time, if I could get into an English class, I would read books. I mean, I would always bring a book with me, but I somehow came across this one. I had heard, about it before. I knew there was like a movie, and so then I read that and Remains of the Day. And what was interesting is I didn't know he was this unreliable narration master. But then as the novels progressed both times, I realized like, oh my God, this is like unreliable narration happening. But what's funny is that so many modern authors I know, like they almost preface it. Like I see this on Substack, like this is an unreliable narration story, or like people talk about that. But Ishiguro doesn't have to say it. He just does it in every single novel and hits the mark, I would say, every single time. Like I feel like his books, When We Were Orphans and The Unconsoled, kind of suck, or like aren't as good, I should say, as some of his other work. But other than those two, I like all of his stuff. So Never Let Me Go is a pretty dark story about a bunch of kids whose organs are going to be harvested one day. It's a dystopic reality where cancer and all these other things have been solved, but the only thing that hasn't been solved is organ decay. So people can live a long time, kind of like, Spice in Dune. But how do you get these organs? Well, the government had basically at the start, behind the scenes, just started making clones and getting these organs. And so this novel is a novel that is about ethics and love. But what Ishiguro would say is that he's a pronounced atheist. He's a hardcore atheist. And I won't say hardcore atheist, but he's an atheist. And his thought that built this novel was that what if I lessened the lifespan of a human and showed in a more passionate way all the things that we do, you know, like it's all going to be okay. Like we love each other. We're going to be in heaven together one day. You know, I know that's like, for instance, what like the Mormons believe, like, you know, if you get married in the temple, you're going to be with your family forever in the celestial kingdom. And honestly, it's sad. It's making me emotional. You know, I have a daughter now and I love my wife more than anything. And it's sad to know that I'm going to die. But, you know, that's why you get that Hemingwayian time out in nature. That's why you meditate. That's why, like, you could, anyway. But Ishiguro does this confrontation where if a lot of the people who die, let's say they're somewhere from 60 to 90, it's not as sad when someone that old dies. I mean, it is sad, but it's much sadder when someone young dies because they know they're going to die. Imagine knowing that you were going to die at 25 in the modern world with technology and everything. And so what he does, which is a genius idea, is increase the rate that these students fall into a lot of the same traps that he feels like people fall into about their conceptions of the world, that like we're going to be with each other after death and that life has meaning and all these things. If you lessen it, then these characters have to confront it early and at a young age, because many people, you know, honestly, there's so many people I know that don't confront these questions until they're like 60. They start going back to church once they're retired and reading books again and thinking about all this. And, you know, that's the Indian way. I don't remember its name. But in Indian society, the first 25 years of life, you should focus on asana and the physicality of the body. Then for the next 25 years, you should focus on pranayama, like breathing exercises to regulate your system so that you can work. Because if you're working and managing a family, what you actually need is like techniques to calm your brain down, and breathing exercises are awesome for that. And then from 50 to 75, when you retire, you're supposed to meditate and start preparing for death and calming the brain. And then from 75 on, you're just supposed to be in total preparation for death. But in Western society, we don't have anything like that. We don't really think that way, even though we kind of do fall into those slots. And so this novel is beautifully written. Ishiguro can write great lines, great prose, and it's got this nostalgic feel the entire time. It's kind of got this dark academic feel because these kids are at this boarding school. And yeah, I mean, you know, I'll tell you guys, half the people in the book club, and there were like 14 people, this wasn't their favorite book. But I absolutely love this book. I think that if you come into it with an open mind, if you care about humanitarian issues in general and humans and this experience of grappling with truth and all of that, you'll have a really good time with this one. And it's a gateway to some of Ishiguro's other novels, which I feel like are even better. Remains of the Day, An Artist of the Floating World. Even Clara and the Sun over here was pretty good. Like, he has a lot of really good stuff. He's one of the few people I believe should have won the Nobel Prize in Literature who did get it. And so, yeah, all writers need to read this too. All writers need to read through Ishiguro's entire bibliography. Like, I can't stress this enough that as a writer, you are in constant training. It's almost like being in special operations in the military. You need to know boxing, jujitsu, stuff with knives, stuff with guns, all of the survival stuff, protocol, dealing with humans, de-escalation, like all these different things. And you're constantly learning. And you may not ever need to do that. You may not ever need to know how to do an armbar or, do something like that out in the field. But for that one moment where you do need it, my God, will be glad that you have it. You know, when you're in some close quarters and some dude runs around and you hit the fucking Aikido move or whatever that the weird dude with the headband came and showed you that one day, and everyone was laughing him off. The same is true with writing. You may not think that you'll need an unreliable narration or that's what's happening, but one day it's going to happen. And if you don't have that in your head and you don't have that reference, then you're screwed. That's why reading a couple hundred books as a writer, especially at the start, is so important, because you have a reference. Like, I do this all the time. I'll be writing something and I'm like, oh wait, I know someone who's done this before. And I go look and I'm like, oh, that's how they did it. That's really cool. It's a really important thing to have. And if you are writing fiction and you are under the age of 60 and you have multiple decades left, I can guarantee you will need unreliable narration at some point. And this is who you need to have in your toolbox. As a reader, I would just also recommend this because it's really fun reading. Like, Ishiguro it gives me that feeling like I'm reading something important and it's doing something for me, but I don't feel like I have to climb a mountain to get there, which is like really awesome for me, especially when I'm like getting momentum. And so, yeah, speaking of dark academia, next we have Donna Tartt's The Secret History. And this has been like and Never Let Me Go also are very popular books. And The Secret History has been like very popular, maybe more on like the book talk, mainstream booktube side of the aisle. But Donna Tartt can write, man. Like some dude just kept leaving a comment for like a year. You got to read Donna Tartt. You don't know anything about female authors unless you read her. So eventually I was like, okay, I'm just going to read one with the book club, whatever. And it was a big success. Everybody liked them. Everybody liked this book that read it. We had some person in the book club that had read this like 15 times. And so this novel, is about it's interesting. On the first page of the novel, you hear that the suspense is over, which is very Greek. If you read the Iliad, for instance, you know exactly what's going to happen at the start. When you read a lot of Greek stuff, when you look at the chorus, they tell you what has happened, like with Oedipus or whatever. And so this novel starts the same way. It starts off by saying that this character, this student, Bunny, is dead. And the novel is like showing us how we get there. So it's kind of like a murder mystery, but it's wrapped up in the humanities. So this novel is about this group of students at this Vermont college who are studying under this kind of famous professor of the classics, this genius, some dude, fictionalized person who knew George Orwell and Ezra Pound and all these people. And he's now a professor, and he only has like an exclusive group of students who he teaches Greek to in the classics. And yeah, I mean, it's an intro. This one is a page turner for sure. Now that I have a daughter and I'm juggling so much, long gone are the days where like I'll be reading and like usually I try to read before bed, but usually I'm reading before bed. And then when it's time for bed, I'm like, thank God. And I'm like asleep. I'm like, oh my God, Jesus. But with this book, I was reading before bed and then I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh, I want to go a little bit more. So I was like, all right, see you guys, I'm going to go. I made some excuse up. I was like, I'm just going to go, like, I'm hungry a little bit. So I was hungry. So I was eating and reading. And like, we usually go to bed like maybe 9 o'clock. Suddenly I'm deep in it. Suddenly I'm finishing this. And it's like 1:30 in the morning and I'm finally coming back in the room. And my wife is like, what were you doing? I was like, oh, sorry, I was reading. She's like, damn, it must have been a good book. And so I'm not going to sit here and say that this is War and Peace or something like that, but this is a fun read that does deal with some really cool concepts. It really kind of integrates aspects of the classics into the story. So won't spoil anything here, but there are like tropes, characters. So these kids are learning about the classics. And the idea of education, right, is to embody your education, to integrate a literary renaissance, everyone. I talk about it here all the time. But what if you integrated it at all? What if you really were living this kind of tumultuous, crazy lifestyle that the Greeks were living? What if you embodied it completely in the modern world? What would happen? And that's what this novel is kind of about. And it's also just a kind of a typical page-turning novel about college, coming-of-age stuff. But yeah, I think the murder stuff like really drives the novel. And it gets crazy, you guys. Like, I'll just say, I think you will like this novel. If you read it, you may come away with it being like, oh, if you're like super like prissy or something, like, oh, I need to go read Zizek or something right now to balance myself. But I feel like this is a book that the book talk, the mainstream booktube side of the aisle, like got right in terms of their appreciation of it. So next we have Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. And once again, people ask me, how do you juggle this? How do you juggle a Pynchon novel, Anna Karenina, all these long novels? Well, I get these novels started way before, months before it's time to read them, and I'm juggling a lot of stuff at once. And so, for instance, we read this a couple weeks ago, and I had started this all the way back in like May during like final exam week when I was just sitting there. I just started grinding it out a little bit. Then I listened to part of it, and I would listen to part of it. I took a road trip with my family, and I listened to part of it on that trip. My wife loves this novel and has read it twice already. So it was actually nice because she just hopped right back into it. I was like, she's like, can we listen to an audiobook? I was like, what? And I was looking at like what we had, and she's like, where are you at in this book? Let's just listen to Anna Karenina. And so, yeah, we got like 6 or 7 hours done of that. So I don't even know where to start with this one, you guys. This is one of the more transformative novels of all time, especially if you have a more spiritual bent, relation toward reality. So just from a craft lens, Tolstoy does such a great job with the point of view of this novel, and he starts off in this like very omniscient mode, but then in important moments it can shift perspectives, and he is a master of that. It's not as like clunky as like a Frank Herbert's Dune or something like that. Which isn't a good example, but nonetheless, that just came to my mind. So without spoiling anything, a perspective that we talked about in the book club, which I think was pretty interesting, is that most of the time this novel is seen as one of the characters, Levin, being the ideal, and then Anna being kind of the fallen. But when you read this, if you kind of view both as being fallen individuals, it shows three different kinds of tragedy. Excuse me. In Anna's case, it shows the tragedy of being a passionate individual in this society we've created, this society that is judgmental, that does not reward, authenticity and all that, and there's a big critique of the aristocracy in Russia, but we live under many of the same restraints today. And then in terms of Levin, it's about the tragedy of consciousness, which is such a big theme in like Tolstoy's work and in Dostoevsky and so many other people at that kind of like turn of the century. Tolstoy knew that that's what we were going to be dealing with, that everyone gaining access to consciousness and awareness and like all of that was going to be kind of a disaster. And so Tolstoy for sure was like thinking of, I should say, being a precursor to kind of existential thought. And that's because Tolstoy was going through something very similarly in his life. You can read about this in his book, A Confession, which we'll be reading in January in the book club. We will also be finishing Tolstoy's entire bibliography. I think that we've read 3 of his works already in 2026 if you are interested in Tolstoy. And so I'll save a rant on this for another video. I feel like if I want to talk about this, I can do 30 to 60 minutes, and I would rather speak to people who have read this novel, because everything I want to say will be an instant spoiler. And so I'm going to move on from this. Read this novel if you haven't already. It's very important, I would say. And yes, moving on. So next we have V by Thomas Pynchon, which is his first novel ever. And honestly, I'll tell you guys, this one was kind of a slog to get through. I think that it wasn't a slog, actually. There were parts of this that were a slog. Thomas Pynchon can be a very hard author to read, especially in his harder works like V, Gravity's Rainbow, Mason and Dixon. Like, they can be hard, but books like Bleeding Edge, Inherent Vice, I'm sure his new book, The Crying Lot of 49, they are much more accessible and readable. So this novel has fragments of what Thomas Pynchon would end up doing his entire career. Like, for instance, it has a noir element of, that is in The Crying Lot of 49, Bleeding Edge, this new novel, and Inherent Vice. There's this search for V that doesn't really go anywhere. I mean, not really spoiling anything. If you've read a Pynchon novel before, nothing ever really goes anywhere. There's really never any resolution. I'm just spoiler alert for the entire bibliography. So this is a postmodernist book, and is kind of starts building on this Nabokovian and Joycean idea of having a competent and grounded protagonist. And so characterization and all that is thrown out the window. But one of the cool things that I liked about this is that it puts like history, sex, power, entropy inside this like literal energetic body within the novel. And it's a critique of history. It's a critique of what we've created in the modern world. I wouldn't call this novel anti-civilization or anti-technology, but it definitely is a pushback against what governments have done, what corporations have done, which is a theme in many of Pynchon's later novels. And this novel made me rethink how I view historical fiction, because Pynchon makes this kind of analogy that it's like a woman that's made of like a bunch of prosthetic parts, that when we look back at history, it is patched together by our conceptions of it, even if you are a historian or whatever. It's all secondhand, and I really feel like that's true. And like, anyway, like that's a big theme in Pynchon's novels, but this one like is, a lot of the time in first novels, like Cormac McCarthy and The Orchard Keeper was this way, and Pynchon in this one, they are much more overt. Like, a lot of the other stuff doesn't work, but some of Pynchon's more personal writing, his thoughts on the world are actually more available in this one than a lot of his other novels. Like some of his later novels, like Bleeding Edge has some good rants about technology and stuff. But yeah, V is an awesome novel if you're already into Thomas Pynchon. And I'm doing a Thomas Pynchon club right now. We're reading through all of his works. And so we were ready for this. And so the next book on our list is The Idiot by Dostoevsky. And this one was an interesting read for me, because this time when reading it, I really looked at it through the lens, and I caught on to it early on that because I was simultaneously reading Joseph Frank's biography, Dostoevsky, and what he was saying about the conception of this novel. And this is one of the greatest biographies of all time of any author, or any person. And so this is the abridged version, which is over 1,000 pages. The unabridged version is like 5,000 pages. So imagine that. That's crazy. David Foster Wallace apparently read it. And one day I will read it too. Once I get through his bibliography again with the book club, we are reading all of Dostoevsky's books in 2025 and 2026. I'm going to read the unabridged version and then read some scholarship stuff, and then feel like I have a pretty good handle on Dostoevsky. But really one of the main transformative messages of this one, and it's really an idea, and sometimes through negation, we can get to these higher principles. And the idea is, can you actually be a pure soul in this world right now? Honestly, you guys. And if you are a pure soul, are you actually helping people, or are you just a fool? And that's what this book really is exploring. And that's why this book is called The Idiot, because Mishkin is this idiot because he's just this kind person, this saintly figure in a corrupt world. And it's a nice inversion, because most stories in the Western canon, and one could say Don Quixote is maybe an exception to this, but a lot of stories are these coming of age novels, or these stories with this protagonist that is trying to navigate the world, and most of the time meets tragic consequences, or the people around him do, or her. But with this one, what happens if you have a character that can't navigate society and you watch society corrupt them, but not corrupt them in a way of like, oh, we got Johnny to take a hit of acid and do something dumb, but rather like make him more of an imbecile, make him lose that positive outlook on the world. And so what Dostoevsky was doing here, it was writing this parable to Christ. And that's what he said in his letters and in his conception of this. And it's this idea that Dostoevsky and Tolstoy came to, that we are killing Christ, not literally, but socially, with how we are acting. I mean, you could just can look at many different conceptions of Christianity and how it's being lived out in the world. And it's just like killing it. I mean, it's insane. And so The Idiot, it was kind of a slog for me. I'm just going to be honest here. I do read these books on time frames, which sometimes can make it a little bit harder, because it's like, I have 3 days left. I have 300 pages to go. I want to get this done. And some of these books aren't as inspired of reads. And that's just kind of what happens when you run a book club. But it was a slight slog, but I do feel like this is, I don't know. I'm going to do a video on ranking Dostoevsky novels, but I would call this one a middle of the pack Dostoevsky novel. And if you are reading it alongside this biography, which I recommend you do, read this. If you are into Dostoevsky and are reading his novels, read this. And if you read it alongside many of the more famous novels, you don't have to read like Poor Folk or some of the other stuff, some of the unfinished novellas, then I think you will really get a lot from this. And so, so that was book number 8 that we've talked about. And those are all the books I read with the book club, but I read these 3 books independently. And so our first book is a fantasy novel by China Miéville, which I don't know if I've talked about him on this channel before. I've only read one of his other books. And I read Perdido Street Station. And this was just sitting at my job. And I was just bored one day and decided to start reading it. It's literally been in my possession for like 10 years now, and I've just never read it. And I thought this entire time that this wasn't a fantasy novel. For whatever reason, I always saw the cover, and now I could see the wings on it, and like that has a huge part of the book. But I thought it was like some like taxi driver literary fiction thing that was like speculative, for just whatever reason. I don't know why. And so when I started reading it, suddenly I was thrown into this world of fantasy. And so one of the first things I liked about this novel was that it was like steampunk oriented. It was like kind of like an urban hellscape steampunky type thing. And it was like very realistic. There were like, so this novel features all the different types of creatures and flying creatures and like all different types of species, one could say, that can talk and communicate. And I'm honestly kind of a sucker for post-industrial stuff. Like, I don't really seek it out, but when it falls on my lap, whether that's in a movie or in a video game or just in a novel or an anime, I'm usually just like, okay, this is fine with me. And so there are some like, now I'm going to talk about this one in a fantasy series because I like this one. I thought this wasn't the greatest fantasy. I think this is definitely like a great fantasy novel if you want to check it out. But Miéville, from what I know, and I've listened to some of his interviews before, he is definitely more on the left side of the political aisle. And so there is a ton of like class exploitation stuff in this, police exploitation, corruption, black market exploitation. scientific progress being harnessed by the government, like conspiracy stuff going on in this one. And so I usually like that. I think that literature is a really good way to critique that. And I think that fantasy, especially, some people think I don't like fantasy or science fiction, but I think that it should be used for a purpose. Like, okay, I don't want to, I don't need to get into some bestiality like love story between these, two different invented species in some author's head. I would rather be able to get immersed in this fantastical world and then have certain types of messaging and allegories shown to me, and because I'm more receptive and I think that it's a fantasy world, then after I'm done, I'm like, wait, this is happening in my reality too. I feel like that's where fantasy and science fiction are really, really effective. And that's why when people hear, when you hear people talk about Malazan or Jane Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, Dune, Hyperion, whatever, those are all like huge allegories to what like we're experiencing in our reality. And I feel like this one, even though it isn't as like maybe as epic and as overt, it definitely hits the mark on that, which is one of the elements of a transformative novel. It's not just a story, it's something more. I also like the monsters or the antagonists in this. They feed on consciousness and like that, and it's like a overarching metaphor for addiction and other things. Like I said, I'm not trying to spoil very much. It's really easy to, but this book is weird. There's this movement called New Weird that Mieville is like one of the champions of, one of like the big progenitors of. And I feel like it's a really good zone if you're into horror or speculative fiction and you have these fantastical ideas. I feel like that's like a really good direction. And like there's obviously a bunch of shit in it, just like every single genre, but I feel like if it's done well, I mean, it really shows modern consciousness. We watch anime. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I've seen a ton of anime, read manga, and a lot of it is like embodies these new weird principles, or has like a lot of crazy stuff happening. And I feel like in the West, we haven't figured that out yet. When it comes to like animes or manga, whatever, they can have weird stuff going on that also includes picture, that also isn't necessarily like crazy long or crazy complicated, and have major themes being pushed. I mean, it's like one of the most famous animes of all, like Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. Like that's not a complicated story, but it's like a transformative story. It's like a deep story, and also plays on these kind of cyberpunk odd elements. And so, yeah, this one was fun for me. I ripped through this while at work. So yeah, I would recommend this to everyone out there who likes fantasy. So next on the list, we have a entertaining crime novel named Fuzz by Ed McBain. And this has also been on my list. I was reorganizing some bookshelves in this house and I saw this, and this is one of David Foster Wallace's favorite books, a book that he gave to a lot of people. And I've never just read it, and I was like, dude, this is 150 pages. I'm going to read it. And the reason that David Foster Wallace liked this one because he believed that transformative writers needed to read more entertaining fiction. And I 100% agree with that. Like, I feel like one of the best uses of entertaining fiction is for transformative writers to see how good some of it can be. Like this story, this crime novel is good. Like you're going to sit and read it. And I was blowing through this. Like I was totally invested in the story. Did it transform my life? No, but there are multiple things that I took away from this, or ideas or levels to the game as a writer that I saw in here that I would say that I can add to my toolbox for later, like I was talking about with Kazuo Ishiguro. And that's something that everyone should be looking at, because the best novels in the world are transformative and entertaining, and you can control both of those elements. You can add transformative elements and you can add entertaining elements. It's not just some unconscious dump. Like you are in full control of it. And once you start to see all the tricks that are being used, you see that they are just tricks and they happen over and over and over again. And it's really just about the sequencing and placing the right tool in at the right time, or the right, whatever, for the greatest amount of success. And like that's what being a writer is about. At some level, being a writer is getting over this Lynchian idea. And David Lynch was very conscious with his art process once he got over the initial stuff. But once you are deep into a draft or into your work, it's about consciously manipulating it to make it as good as possible. And when you look at the best authors in the world, they don't just sit there and say, done. They thousands of hours thinking about just little problems. And so, yeah, this one was pretty good. I mean, David Foster Wallace has, I think, a list of 10 or 20 entertaining novels everyone should read, and this is one of them. And I've gone a lot from reading like 10 or 15 of those books. And then last but not least, I read The Ox-Herding Tale by Charles Johnson. And Johnson is most known for his novel, The Middle Passage. But this one is a very interesting book. And I'm actually going to release a video on this and my top 10 African-American authors soon here on YouTube, because I'm going to launch a $1 a month membership. And so that should be launching today or tomorrow. But anyway, so I read this because I was reading this and then inspired the idea for that video. And so I will put that out for you guys. But this is an odd book. This is a slave narrative that's also fused with Buddhism, if you can imagine. And so this is about a mixed blood slave, half white, half black that, becomes literate and starts to study. And it's not set in like as harsh as of an environment as you see maybe other slave narratives have, where like there's a ton of brutality. There is some brutality, but overall it's about this slave, this man, Andrew, who is kind of navigating both of these worlds. And it's a quick read. I wouldn't say it's terribly amazing. I would more put it on the good category. I mean, if you are interested in literature like this, I feel like this would be in like that sphere of books that you should read. I mean, if you're interested in African American literature, this Charles Johnson is a classic author and one of the best alive right now. And so, yeah, this is one I read. I don't have too many comments on it. If you guys want to see my comments, I talk about it for like 10 or 15 minutes in that top 10 African American authors video that will be launching soon for all my YouTube members that want to pay $1. I'm going to be releasing a ton more content from the vault and some other cool stuff. And so thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys for the support. If you guys want to join the book club, I would love to see you guys in there. We have a crazy schedule. It is out right now. Go see what we are doing. I would love to meet you, and I will see you guys very soon in the next video.